Welcome to the Dreaming Wild, where we invite the unseen to dwell in us and guide us deeper. I'm Dani West, somatic dreamworker and your host. In a world drunk on urgency and careening into chaos, we gather to ritualize slowness, rewild our psyche, incubate the imaginal, and root into the animate forces that shape our lives. By doing so, we make more room for magic to land in our bones and in our world. Turns out we could use a little magic these days. If you're loving the show, come join our patron community over at thedreamingwild.com. Thank you so much for sharing, subscribing, and boosting our reach. The Dreaming Wild wouldn't exist without the direct support of this amazing community. Today's guest is Sage Stoneman, a multidisciplinary artist and natural builder who believes that building homes in harmony with nature is a therapeutic and empowering practice of returning to our spiritual source. After learning from the legendary Sunray Kelly, he's been featured on the Discovery Channel and has traveled the U.S. designing and building natural sculptural homes and facilitating workshops. His work merges natural building education with group work, body awareness, nature immersion, artistic expression, meditation, and improvisational play. This episode is all about getting into right relationship with our world. We explore ways to cultivate an animist lens, how to ground our spirituality, and real ways to divest from harmful systems. Sage is a powerhouse of inspiration for all those seeking resiliency in the face of systems collapse. And now onto our episode, Co-Liberation and Relational Spirituality. Thank you again for spending the whole day tracking down Wi-Fi and making your way into modernity so that we could plug in and create a virtual connect. Mm-hmm. So I want to kick off the conversation today with something I found on your website recently. I hopped on and noticed this beautiful gallery of all of your natural building and invitations to collaborate. And there was something that really struck me. You said the first step is to listen to the land. And if the land says no, then the project is a no. And I'd love to hear from you what that means. Why do you hold that sanction in place? What does listening to the land look like for you? And why do you take that as the first step?
Yeah, so I wrote that as a way of holding myself accountable to my values, because I observed that there were definitely projects where my own psychology was getting in the way of my relationship with spirit and with the elements and with reality, as our psychology tends to do. And so like the need for approval, being the one behind the wheel of our work in the world. I mean, especially because I got into my work young. Like I started doing this natural building work as not just a builder and laborer, but as a visionary and designer for clients who are just like, by some grace of God, trusting me, this kid, to just like build a structurally sound home for them. I mean, it's really weird actually that I even like ended up doing what I do as an artist, because I never studied construction and I don't think of myself as a builder, and I never studied architecture or engineering, but I effectively work as an architect, engineer, and lead builder for every aspect of the build, but it's all art for me. Anyway, I just say that to give context, because as a young person getting into that work, there's so much pressure and need to perform and need to produce some result that like some of that pressure is coming from the client in reality, but some of it's also just my own stuff that I'm recreating from the past and trying to make things okay, trying to seek love and approval through my work. And at some point, I realized that it's more important to listen to the earth. I think it's always been really clear to me, partly because of the way that my dad raised me with Eastern spirituality, that the most important thing in life is to have a relationship with reality, to be self-realized, to realize who we are in reality. I didn't really get any earth-based tradition, like any indigenous knowledge from my upbringing. But I was lucky to have grown up in Ojai, where there's proximity to people who carry that indigenous and native wisdom to this land here. And mostly through community in the Native American church, I was sort of introduced to spirituality through nature, which I discovered as a kid, of course, but the context of like, this is a spiritual practice to have an elemental relationship with the earth. I'm kind of coming from a lot of different angles here, but I'm synthesizing one answer. So throughout my work, which is very elemental work, because I'm working with earth and I'm working with wood, I'm working with water. And then also through the introduction to those indigenous ways and through the foundation of a more Advaitic approach to spirituality, which is an Eastern philosophy, I kind of synthesized my own perspective of what am I doing here? You know, what is it that I'm doing beyond just what the client relationship is? And then Sunray, my mentor, my building mentor, also said the same thing. I mean, it's funny. There's a book I just noticed right in front of me called Builders of the Pacific Coast. And he's featured in that book. And I don't remember the exact quote, but it says, my clients think I'm building for them, but I'm building for the spirits. And so I just kind of like, from a bunch of different angles, you know, realized that that's what I'm doing. That's not how I always behave. But I put that, when I created the website, I put that to hold myself accountable more than anything else.
Yeah, I love all of this. And I really appreciate you starting with, you know, your entry into the work and that imposter syndrome showing up because you're not credentialed, you're not approaching this from like a linear kind of way. And you're not exactly relying on conventional, you know, building modes that you could just Google search this or, you know, flip a book open and figure that. I mean, the type of building you're doing is highly intuitive and deeply creative. So it's really beautiful to hear that the way that that opened up for you was actually about like broadening your sense of identity and broadening your sense of the project and broadening your sense of collaboration. I mean, here's you, little you. Here's little client. Here's all the ideas about ownership and outcomes. And then here's life and here's the movement of life.
I mean, I don't even know how to not prioritize that. Like, I haven't ever been conventional in any way, really. And I just like, sometimes it works to my benefit and other times it doesn't. But I just like, I'm just very emotional and I don't really have patience for transaction that feels like it isn't rooted in something real. But yeah, it is ultimately about accountability and how it's so, our world is so oriented. I mean, I don't know, I should clarify what I mean by our world. I mean, I'm talking about, you know, the Western world and like even more specifically, just like being here in the United States and even more specifically in Southern California, and like the kind of cultural paradigm that we're living in is so transactional and so focused on a definition of success that really has no ground in reality, in my opinion. And I have a tendency to just make the project more important than anything. And that's me as an artist. And then that's also me as a human being who's wounded and hasn't healed certain aspects of myself that don't hold myself in high esteem.
How does the project take precedence over what exactly?
Usually my well-being is the first thing that I'm, you know, that comes to mind. I've done a lot of work on that over the last couple of years, but I had to like really hit the brakes hard to realize that that was necessary. I mean, since I was 15 working in the Rainbow Bridge Deli, I haven't ever worked for anyone, you know? So I've like always been forging this very, not only like a self-employed path, but a very unconventional path, as you said, that doesn't really, I don't really have much of I don't have a whole lot to lean on. I had Sunray, who you know, more than any technical skill, which he taught me a lot of technical skills, but more so than any of that was just getting to see that someone like him exists, and just having that confidence imbued within me that's like, oh, I can just kind of move through the world just creating weird, crazy stuff, and maybe people will like it, and just like have the audacity to do so, and have faith in it. I can move through the world like that, and that's a blessing, you know? I mean,
and can be so involved. I mean, there's a lot of really rich themes here, because I feel like when we refuse the 9 to 5 and we pick up an unconventional path, I feel like what we don't realize we're doing is picking up the 24/7 path.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fully immersive. And especially if you're being guided by a sacred pull, you know, that devotional path, it's like, I think it's really easy to lose your sense of self or self-care, because it's working on you all the time, whether you're in the project or not. You're an open channel to get insights and perspectives, or you're dreaming about it, all of the things. It's like really such a generous offering of self to walk that kind of path.
It's intense. I mean, I have, you know, like, you're basically, it's a sacrifice. It's like I'm sacrificing my relationship with myself to have that open channel, which is sometimes just like, you know, prioritizing where is this log going to come from that I'm going to use for this post that needs to be this certain shape. And that's like more important than whatever, like I need to take care of my hair or something, you know?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
And like, and I had, you know, again with Sunray, like he didn't really take good care of his body. And so I had a great example of a person who was like so embodying of that open channel, and like proof that that's possible, but also evidence of what happens to the person when you do that. And so then being, you know, starting to discover self-care after having opened that channel with Sunray, and then trying to, you know, figure out how to balance the two. And I'm still in that process very much. So I feel like,
aren't we all?
Yeah. I feel like I've come a long way. But I'm very much still learning that balance of self-care. And and like you said, it's 24/7, and I'm not working 24/7. I'm just an open channel 24/7, like you said, to whatever needs to be created next, whatever's on my path, whatever I am here to create next. And so sometimes clients, so to speak, come in as these spirit guides to just, you know, change the path a little bit. And they have, you know, the project that they think they're going to do with Sage Stoneman has nothing to do with my path. They're just a little like, you know, signpost on the path that's like, go this way. And so that's where it gets really interesting and fun if I'm like really living that way. But that's what that kind of statement of like, it's about the land, where that comes from, because ultimately I don't care what someone wants me to build for them. It's never about that. And the land is, if I'm spiritually disconnected from my path and I'm not paying attention to that truth, the land will reorient me. So if I can get out of my own way enough to listen to the spirits where I am, then they're going to just be like, hey, you know, your path's actually that way, you know?
Yeah. Do you have any stories that might illustrate that? I just can imagine like synchronicities or interruptions, or, you know, we think we're doing this on one day and then something blows up and it rebuilds itself.
There's a project I was going to do for someone, or I thought I was going to do for someone in Santa Barbara. And I was already kind of on edge about it because it's a really wealthy person. And so there's that's right away. There's the ego, you know, like, first of all, I judge wealthy people and have a lot of anger towards people who have money. And then I also want their money. So there's this contradiction and this hypocrisy in that. And so I'm like, this is like sketchy already.
Loaded.
and I'm relating to the project manager. I'm not even relating to the owner of the property. They really liked this thing on the website, by the way. They're like, that's so beautiful that you want to honor the land. And I'm like, cool, okay, well, I don't really trust anything you're saying because you have a bunch of money.
Yeah.
But anyway, it ended up not happening, but I had collected all of this cedar wood from up north in the Sierra foothills. I went to a friend's birthday gathering up there, and there was someone there who had a bunch of dead standing cedar trees that had burned in a fire a few years ago, and offered them to Bobby and I to just fell the trees that are there standing. They're totally
awesome,
ready to build with because they're dry. And, they've already burnt. So we were doing them a favor by helping clear that fire risk, basically. And then I thought I was bringing those logs down for this job. I actually even dropped them all off there. And then when the job fell through, I had to pick them up and bring them home, but just completed this beautiful structure at home with that cedar that I wouldn't have had if it wasn't for being at this party 24/7, thinking about where's the wood going to come from for this project that I'm doing. I wouldn't have gone out of my way to spend the whole day collecting all of that wood and then also make a really beautiful connection to the person who stewards that land. And then, it's like the materials wanted me to move them and, assemble them in a certain way. It's just like, I'm just like a little ant just moving the wood from there to there. And I had to have that idea to say yes to the wood. And so I feel like that kind of thing is always happening.
Yeah.
And then there's also times where like I've done projects where I'm just getting hurt a lot, and it's because I should have said no and I didn't. And like,
interesting.
There's signs, there's signs left and right. I think really it's all about having a relationship with reality. And there's so much that we're in relationship with at all times that we don't recognize when we are prioritizing what our egoic mind thinks is the next step of the process. And I'm fascinated by that, towing that line, especially with building, because it's such a pragmatic practice.
Yeah.
And it's been really challenging and really enlightening at times.
There is something really specific about the building piece and the way you're merging this sort of, you're taking these platitudes and you're really packing them into something that's so hands-on. And I imagine there's a lot that goes into like coordinating the materials. How do you bridge the non-linear art with what probably needs to be a very kind of linear protocol?
One of the most recent projects I did, we had all of the wood that we needed for the roof, and then we did a cob workshop, and during the workshop it was like, let's make the walls lean out like this instead of this. And then I was like, yeah, that's fun, and we like made the walls lean out. And then when the workshop's over, this whole like 2-week experience with 40 plus people, then I'm sitting there alone and looking at the building, and I'm like, now I need to cut down 2 more trees and mill them and extend the roof by 4 feet in all directions because the walls are leaning out. And, it's like, there's things like that where you can go with the flow, but then it's going to lead you, there's just a consequence to that flow, which you can continue to do that in the flow. But there's definitely moments where I'm like, I wish there was a person who is being a project manager in that moment that could have said, no, don't make the walls lean out like that because we have a certain
consequences.
This consequence isn't worth it. And then that, like, again, I get into the egoic mind. I'm like, well, then that's why you start a business and you have a project manager. And it's like, but ultimately I'm an artist. If I'm going to label myself as anything, and there's just different kinds of artists. And, there's a painter who has their all of their different colors of paint really neatly organized, and you bring these ones over to this shelf and those ones to that one, and I'm just not that kind of artist. So I always have like 4 different processes going on at once at least, which sometimes means I'm like milling wood with cob on my feet still, like just like in the mud and then in the wood and then with the chainsaw and then on the ground and up the tree, and just like those are all the tools, and it feels totally insane sometimes, but it's just what I'm here doing.
Well, I think there's a lot of power in the boldness of like riding the chaotic wave. I mean, yes, there's the painter that will do the color study and multiple sketches and draft and redraft, and there's a beauty to that. Yeah, a precision and a refinement. But I think when you really dive into life and you let life move and rumble, there are some maybe casualties and inefficiencies along the way that you have to scoop up and hoist up and patch. But But is there anything you could say about the aliveness and the flow? It feels to me like you're turning the dial up on the flow factor when you ride it that way.
Yeah, that feels accurate to me for sure, and I think it's embodied in the art too. It's like there's that aliveness in the finished piece that it's a compilation of stories. There's stories and there's emotion and tension in the embodied form that is a result of those processes. And I think there's definitely a really relatable human beauty in that everyone can appreciate whether they know what they're perceiving or not.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like things would really come alive in that kind of context, in that kind of field. It's like there's so much room for things to move.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's a lot to feel, and I think ultimately when I look back on all these moments, I do value what I have felt in those moments where I wish I did, where I wish I was more pragmatic or something.
What kinds of feelings spark for you when you're writing that way? I'm imagining you surfing right now, by the way, as we're on this topic, as you catch those waves and you're with the groups of people, what kinds of feelings come through?
So many different feelings. I mean, sometimes it's stress, high stress, and sometimes it's, what's the word I'm looking for? Like fanatic.
Frenetic.
Frenetic. Yeah, that's the word I wanted.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's also fanatic. But frenetic is what I was thinking. And just like, just on edge, like flying by the seat of my pants. And that's an energy that I've learned to not act on whenever I can catch it. If I can notice that I'm behaving like frenzy, if I'm in a sort of a frenzy, to just like stop. Because that's never like my true nature to be that way. But then there's other times where I just feel like so in my purpose. And that's usually when there's like a lot of people and a lot of movement, and there's a flow that is not just elemental, not just me and the elements, but me and the human elements as well. And like that kind of movement where I start to get to step back and see people doing their own work together and getting into their own rhythms and finding that synergy and getting to sort of like, I mean, there's some level of orchestration that I'm connected to, but it's not really, it's that flow state where I'm certainly not the one orchestrating it, but I'm, in my role.
Yeah. As the scope broadens and the momentum builds, there's more potential to get swept up into that frenzy. And it seems even more important to pull the energy down and in, feel that still point, especially if you're the quote unquote leader of a project or facilitating a big group, just so crucial to stay in that listening space. And the way that we do that is by slowing down inside. And so I wonder if there's anything you'd like to share about that contrast between the sense of urgency, whether it's like some kind of cultural thing, some kind of project deadline, or even an internal thing like just feeling the pressure to need to complete or get paid or get out and be done or deliver a specific thing for someone. How do you personally navigate that kind of tension between, whoa, this thing is really picking up speed, so I need to come back? How do you come back?
That's a very good question. I'm still answering that question for myself. I've definitely identified that it's an important one. I mean, it really is. There's a quality of listening in which I can actually feel where the person or the process that I'm listening to is, where they're coming from. And if I can focus on that, then it slows me down and it allows me to connect with just what's really going on around me, because there's really never actually a need for that frenetic energy. It's not, there's never too much going on. There's never too much to handle, so to speak. That's just a belief. That's like the little me thinking that. But it's the little me that gets overwhelmed by too much going on is not the one doing anything. That me doesn't do anything ever. It's never done anything. So whatever I can do to be more aware of the people around me and the process around me, rather than the guy that thinks he's in charge of it, the more I'm going to slow down. Now, are there specific practices? I mean, laying down. One thing I was doing during one of the more populated workshops was just after lunch, I would just like lay on the ground and fall asleep on the earth. Like just, like no shoes or shirt on, just like feeling as much of the earth on my skin as possible, and just like close my eyes and fall asleep and wake up and sleep for like 5 minutes. And that's helped me with depression too, at times where it's like, I have so much to do, or this, I should do that, or do I want to do that, or blah, blah, blah. And like, I don't want to do any of it. And just like getting to that moment where you're like, you don't need to do anything. It's okay. Just lay down. It's okay. And if I can allow myself that moment where I can like actually just completely go offline, even for 5 minutes, that helps a lot.
Yeah, this is really good, because I feel like I hear you naming the little me piece. I'm not going to entertain the little me who has this specific agenda and is getting hyped up on, how it's supposed to look. But what you're describing here, in just tapping back in and letting yourself receive and reconnect, recalibrate, let go, surrender, drop in, feels like maybe a different version of little me that's like, oh yeah, I have a body. Like, oh yeah, I have a nervous system. Like I'm going to include myself in the picture here. And like, this is a different kind of little me.
I love that flip. Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, the real little me.
Yeah.
It's like I'm, the me that I can actually make contact with.
Yes.
Because the other one that I'm describing, that's like the one that thinks he has the plan, and like, the strategist, like the one that's like, this needs to be that so that this can be that. And that's the one that I'm saying is like, I'm sorry, but he's never accomplished
Sorry,
anything.
dude.
He's always trying. Sorry, dude. Your main purpose in life is to accomplish, and you've actually never done it. Like,
yeah. You're actually not the main character. Sorry.
No, you've never really done anything. Like, and I think that if anything, maybe that guy's role could be what you're describing, which is like, hey, let's get all of our attention back here to this, like do that strategizing with just the pure intent of like, what is this vessel needing right now? What does the real little me need? Because it's interesting that like that attention usually gets so fixated on everything but the like actual contactable self, like the nervous system and the body.
Creature.
And the creature. Exactly. The creature.
Yeah.
We get into this mode where it's like, it's almost like we actually think that we are all of these everything but the creature, all of the thoughts that the creature that like we think we're
Totally.
responsible for.
Oh,
And
yeah.
yeah, and really, like you're saying, if we can just direct that attention to the creature needs for a moment, then life takes care of the rest, really.
Yeah, this piece kind of loops back into where we started, that self-care piece, and I think it's really interesting how developmentally, I mean, we begin on the path of building persona and building ego and forming a healthy sense of identity so that we can, find our way onto our path. And then there's that beautiful juncture where the artist and intuitive especially begin to dismantle and loosen our grip on our sense of self and realize, like, I'm actually very porous. I'm actually very permeable. And look, like, where does me begin and actually end? I'm constantly being informed by life moving through me. And I think that this place where we loosen our grip is where we can open up to receive the magic and become that circuit. But I think it's also another edge, because if we get too loose and slippery there, we do lose track of the body. And I think that little guy who has ideas about the way it's supposed to be isn't only just a capitalist, isn't only just like a producer. I think the spiritual ego can sneak in there too, with ideas about, like, that sort of projected idea of outcome or tone or flavor or vibe or depth or meaning, can also sneak into the spiritual path. Yeah, I wasn't actually wanting to go there. I wanted to tie it back into the self-care piece and how important it is to kind of like care for our nervous systems and keep our being and creature intact. But I do kind of wonder, your thoughts on the spiritual grandiosity. I mean, being in SoCal, I feel like there's a particular culture that can be performative there. And,
Oh, yeah.
and I wonder if there's any rants or shares that you would like to throw down, or maybe even more interestingly, how you've navigated finding your way to Indigenous communities with a lot of respect as, a white person, like born and raised in Southern California. What have you done to kind of navigate that space so that that devotional path and the spiritual integrity is actually at center, and there's not a runaway guy who is virtue signaling or chasing an idea?
Yeah. That's definitely something I'm very sensitive to, and I mean, honestly, just pissed off by that culture of not just appropriation, but of like just genuinely missing the point of spirituality. And that in spirituality, if you're really connecting with a spiritual truth, then there is no objective. You're not doing anything time-based or anything that you can show any kind of merit for. And you're also, like, I think on this earth, all spiritual work is also elemental work. And so, like, I actually don't think it's possible to have any spiritual experience in an ayahuasca ceremony in LA, for example. I don't think that that's possible. So I'm sorry.
That's a bold one to drop.
But it's
Are you actually sorry?
A little bit, because it's just like, I don't want to rain on anyone's parade, but like you have to be connected to, especially with plant medicines, for example, like ayahuasca. These are medicines that are very specific beings that people have learned to be in relationship with. And it's not enough to like give your ego the task of doing a dieta and then going through all of the this, that, and that to do the ceremony with however real of a shaman you think they are. even if they're of that lineage and of that tradition. And it's really not about race, or about, where you're raised or any of it. It's about the relationship. It's about relationship with the being. And that's not a metaphor. That's not a symbol. These are real beings. And that's something that's overlooked is, the spirit of a plant is a being. And because it doesn't have a face, we don't really understand that. We're so face and eyeball centric in the way that we think, I mean, there's definitely my own arrogance speaking when I say you can't have a spiritual experience in an ayahuasca ceremony in LA. I'm acknowledging that that's, I have strong judgments of that particular subculture. And that's a personal judgment that I actually want to let go of because it holds me back. It's not, I don't want to own that, but I do feel that. But my point
But I feel like what you're protecting here is, and naming and calling out is this sort of extractive approach.
Exactly. Yeah. It's extractive. And I also, what I want to get at with, the concept of LA, for example, is that if you're having a spiritual experience in LA, it's one of wanting to dismantle what you're seeing and nurture people who are hurting. There's so much pain caused by our modern developments, our way of existing, especially in a place like LA. There's so much spiritual and elemental pain embodied in everything around you that
and starvation.
You cannot have a generative experience by siloing yourself in a ceremony and not going out and nurturing the plant that's starving because the concrete is dehydrating it, or the human that's starving because no one gives a shit about them anymore because they're all on to their next yoga class, ceremony, business meeting, Zoom call. Like, spirituality is an experience of interconnectedness with our source and with all that is and with all the beings around us. And it's not enough to just say that. And it's not even enough to do all of your spiritual practices and meditations. You have to live in relationship with all beings in a good way. You have to actually learn to do that and humble yourself enough to do it. And I'm so far from living that life. Like, I'm doing my best, and I'm doing really well at divesting from harmful systems and living a life that's simple and, not extractive as much as I possibly can, and to learn from people who are humbly living it in a way that I admire, which is sometimes they're white people, it doesn't really matter the color of their skin. But I definitely find that most of what I have learned in terms of examples are people who are really connected to their indigeneity. And indigeneity is not an identity. It's certainly not a political identity. It's just it means that you're in relationship with the place that you come from.
And what I feel is implied in what you're saying is taking what you need and moving through these relational circuits from a place of generosity and reciprocity. Like that relational piece, what I feel like you're pointing toward is a giving back and a giving of self, not from a place of taking for me to ascend on my personal path, but really recognizing that me includes you. And so I'm here for the we.
Yeah, totally. And we can be tricky too, because oftentimes we as a congregation of separate individuals that, don't really know who they are or what they want. And so it can get I agree with what you're saying, but I just acknowledging that can get slippery because we don't always know who we are. And so a group of people who don't know who they are as a we can just be exponentially confusing, which is why the elements are so important.
Yeah, it's so funny. I feel like when I'm saying we, I was actually thinking about what it felt like to go and water my garden today. And I could do that in the middle of the day because there was some cloud cover and it felt so good to but yeah, the human we stuff definitely gets sticky. I wonder if there's anything more you could add to kind of to hear you say, like, be in relationship with reality, and the spiritual practice is an elemental relationship, these words feel pretty abstract. And I wonder if there's any way you could kind of break that down for listeners. Like, what can that look like for you? What does that feel like? How does that take form?
Yeah. I mean, it's a largely invisible thing, but it's kind of what you're describing with your garden, just being able to look at a being and see its beingness and see that it's looking back at you too. It's something that you can practice with anything. You can, wherever, if you're listening to this right now and you look around you, just take the first thing that you see. I'm seeing this book, and see its beingness. See that it's looking at you.
Yeah.
You don't need to see eyeballs to feel as if you're looking in someone's eyes. So, feel that energy of, I'm making eye contact, I'm being seen, I'm witnessing and being witnessed by this object. Nothing is an object. And that's what I think, that's one of many things that I have found to be shared amongst indigenous cultures from all over the world is the sense of animacy that we're not living in a world full of we're not an object in a world full of objects that exist to just meet our needs. We're living in relationship with beings, and then there's ways to find that through ceremony with specific plants like tobacco. I like to pray with tobacco. I like to pray to the fire, being grateful to your water that you're drinking. I think bringing awareness to what we're consuming and what we're using, bringing awareness to the beingness of things and to the source of things, and then the ways that we need those things to sustain us.
Yeah.
And the reason that that's hard to do in LA is because the origin of things is so removed. It's hard to know where every ingredient in your latte came from, or, when you go out to the restaurant, even if it's very regenerative, organic, whatever, however they're advertising the restaurant, where did each of those ingredients come from? Who transported them? Who grew them? Who was killed in the process of extracting that oil, of extracting that fuel, of clear cutting the forest so that the plants could be cultivated? All of these things, even when capitalism does its best, through like small businesses and ethical businesses, it's still extracted if you don't have a direct relationship with what you are consuming and using. So there's it's not about judging things outwardly, because I don't think I'm here to say whether someone else is living a spiritual life or not. But I do think that there's a limit to how much you can extract and interact with without any awareness of its origin or relationship to its source before you're really not, you're not embodying yourself as a spirit. You're just completely in this other plane where you're just take, and then we see what that looks like in the world. There's very few people in this world, myself included, who actually are benefiting from this extractive system. In like relating to things spiritually, there comes a certain point where I think, for me at least, it feels like I don't want that to be happening because it's not serving all beings. And so then what can I do to serve all beings to the best of my ability that I'm in contact with? And that's why the groundedness of creating homes with natural materials and in communion with the spirits and with the elements, and sharing that approach with other people who might feel disconnected from that lifestyle. I'm grateful for that path because it feels like something that I can actually offer. And oftentimes it doesn't feel like enough, but it feels like something I can offer. And it feels like a spiritual practice that's actually grounded in my connectedness with all being. So feeling the directness of that harm, I think is part of this conversation. And it's part of how to, like you asked about navigating, as a white man or as someone who isn't raised with these indigenous cultures, how to navigate those spaces. And I mean, it's navigate in humble relationship, not as extraction and not as insertion or injection, or, it's just, I'm here to learn. And I think it's just coming in with that humility and that sensitivity to the directness of our connectedness.
Yeah, there's so much here. And I feel like acknowledging our privilege is foundational. Like, that's 101, right? Watching for the bypass feels like a level 2. Because I think it's really easy to get swept into this is abundance, I'm magnetizing abundance. And I think that can be a really dangerous narrative because it completely ignores the fact that we live in a finite planet with finite resources. Like you're saying, a lot of the luxuries and commodities are coming at other people's expense, but also ecological impact. I mean, it's pervasive and intense. And I think the level 3 piece, like the heartbreak of me, like the reason we rescheduled because I was crying all day and like couldn't show up in front of a camera is because sometimes the guilt can be so heavy and burdensome, and I can really struggle a lot personally with feeling like, okay, I need to feed my kids. Like, I can grow X amount of food, but I want to buy this thing, look, a kombucha from the market. That's going to be whatever it is, scale that up to, filling my tank at the gas station. And we all have that threshold, right? Of like, how much we can take without feeling immobilized by our own guilt from taking it, and then thresholds that we're not willing to cross. And I think it's interesting that you kind of hinted at this earlier with your judgment toward wealthy people who are, obviously holding more resources that they personally need and not necessarily distributing them or putting them toward collective causes. But regardless of your socioeconomic status, like regardless of how much you're quote unquote taking or allowing yourself to receive, I think it's a really relevant question to keep alive and at the forefront of our mind. Like, how can we bring mindfulness and take what we need with, like you're saying, this humble reverence and respect and sober, eyes wide open approach to knowing the impact of what we're receiving, but more specifically, how do we metabolize our guilt? I feel like I could just start crying. Like, how do we cope? Sometimes I feel like I can't even live here. It's too painful. And I know a lot of people feel that way for a moment, for a day, for a month, Any thoughts?
Yeah, I wish I had an easy answer for that question, but I do know that the guilt doesn't help anyone. So that's what I remind myself of.
Yeah.
I don't have, I don't know if there's a tried and true way of being free of that guilt specifically. I know that, I've had hints along the way, just being 100% responsible for myself and doing the best I can based on what I know to be true and based on my feeling of, the sensitivity to the way that the interconnectedness of my life is requiring the oppression of other people to be sustained. And, having that awareness and feeling that is important.
Yeah.
Feeling guilty for it is not important.
Yeah.
It doesn't help anyone. It actually does a disservice to the energetic connection of all things, because it's like, I'm not even, and I'm going to do that and not even be grateful for it. You know? So I think gratitude is a much more appropriate feeling.
Yes.
But it's a matter of how do we get ourselves to that? And I think, again, knowing ourselves as spiritual elemental beings and not as identity roles, not as Sage Stoneman, 30-year-old white male who grew up in Southern California, because that guy is guilty. That how could he not feel guilty? But that's not who I am. That's just a thought. It's really just a thought. That's not who I am.
I don't know. It feels like both, right? Like, we do have this identity. We do have like marked consumption. We do have direct impact, and we are also so much more than. But what's more interesting to me than kind of pushing back on that particular point is feeling into like the way guilt clogs. It clogs and shrinks. And the way to kind of free ourselves up from that is grief and gratitude, like really acknowledging the impact and feeling that and letting it absolve into wonder and gratitude and reverence.
That's definitely the transmutation that occurs. And I think that guilt clog that you're referring to is this, it's what I mean by that's not who I am. I don't mean to say that isn't real. I would say, and I don't know if this is true, but this is just my perspective, is that, I think it's important to establish that I am not that person first. That's not my primary identity. That's just an attribute. That's a part of me. And where I come from and who I am first is much more likely to have compassion and gratitude for that experience and say, it's okay. Like, you don't have to feel guilty of this. You can just do this. Look, here's an alternative. Because oftentimes there's actually easier alternatives than we think. That we are aware of when we're blinded by that guilt or clogged up by that guilt, right? So like taking a higher perspective of it, not numbing ourselves to the pain and the empathy of it, but actually using that pain to take that perspective and say, is there like actually a pathway that's maybe achievable right now? And maybe like a little bit more effort, or maybe not even, maybe less effort, but just, not the beaten path. And like, just taking that moment to step out and like, because I get caught in it all the time and the guilt of it. And then, at the end of the day, it's just like, what could I do a little bit differently so that I feel like I'm living more in alignment with my values? And our values, I think, are just such good guides for these kinds of things, for relieving ourselves of guilt. And I just like starting with that perspective of like, I'm not that guilty person. I'm the witness of that guilty person. And that person is real and important.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to play with. And again, kind of loosening our grip on identity. I think, one of the things that I circle back to a lot is just recognizing the complexity of our collective situation right now is so vast and so deep. It's like, I didn't create these supply chains. I didn't, I've inherited this dysfunction, and I mean, talk about inheritance, epigenetics too, but just the collective momentum, that we've all been thrown into. It's an unanswerable question, and it's what feels like an unsolvable problem. And so I love this forgiveness practice because I think it's really easy to feel, especially like we're raised on a lot of media that is, kid on the dragon, and I'm going to be the normal kid that saves the world. And this kind of notion that can be very compelling, that if I just do all of the things well and with enough heart, that it's going to somehow break the spell that's going to crack this whole thing open. But in reality, it does just look like keeping your eye out for maybe a different way to do it, and felling the cedar that is dead, standing dead. And wow, what a beautiful way to create that reciprocity for like fire prevention and a harvest all at once. Like if we're on the lookout for these things, they do reveal themselves. And maybe it's not about trying to be so self-sacrificing or being so hard on ourselves, but really about just seeing how life can present in new ways and meeting those moments.
Yeah, there's two things that stood out for me. One, like with the cedar, it's like that wouldn't have happened. Like I wouldn't have come into relationship with the cedar, which then turned into something that I took part in building, if I hadn't had that value of not harming, of minimizing harm, essentially, is the value, but specifically of I will not go buy lumber, and that's just a very simple, it's like there's no guilt in that. It's not because I feel guilty, it's because I won't do it. There's no reason to do it. And now that's not something that is appropriate for like, I will not buy anything at the grocery store. Right. You have two kids,
right.
and you live in a town. Like, so it's kind of just a matter of like, auditing what is an appropriate boundary to hold.
Totally.
And finding what those are. And, like here, for example, someone makes biodiesel in town. So I can buy biodiesel.
Awesome.
And so my thing is like, I will not purchase gasoline from a gas station.
Cool.
And that's actually realistic for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I will not go to Home Depot to buy lumber. If I have something to build, it doesn't matter if it makes it take months longer. It doesn't matter if it makes it more expensive. None of those things matter. And we have to train ourselves to actually believe that those things don't matter, and that we have this thing that's going to guide us. And then also you were speaking about how we inherited this world. And it was also just making me think that we also, how much of our lived experience did we inherit? Even this body, I don't know how the blood moves through this body. I don't know how the lungs fill with air when I breathe. I don't know how I'm able to see this miracle of a world and every moment that, somehow is continuous from moment to moment. And I wake up and I'm still this body. And, we inherit all of this. And so I think when we talk about being in relationship with reality, one of the things that interests me a lot and always has, and I've always been very curious about, is who am I that was not inherited? Who am I before everything that was inherited? Is there a sense of myself which is not dependent on anything that came to me as a causal process that was, this led to that, led to that, led to that. And that's not to remove myself from the beautiful interconnectedness of, my nature is because of all my ancestors and my descendants. And my nature as a creature is because of the stars and the elements. And, all of these things are profoundly beautiful. And also, I'm very curious about all of the, just that whole dance, because that part of myself isn't guilty for anything. And it can really lend a loving hand sometimes to the part of myself that is guilty. And it's okay. You're just a sum of infinite causes that you don't even understand most of the time. And you're trying to find a way to understand how you can have agency in that. And you have little sprinklings of agency that are, I don't know how to explain that. But then there's also a witness that's just rooted in presence, which is full of generosity and intelligence and beauty and compassion, not a siloed kind of intelligence and beauty, but one that's very much here to show up for all of life and everything that we're connected to.
So beautiful. I feel teary with waves of chills. all of that was so beautifully said. That compassion comes in. And I feel what also fades is judgment. But what's also interesting is the Technicolor sort of comes up a little higher on clarity about what is right action and what is right relationship. It's there is a very specific intelligence in design and, like you said, orchestration to what wants to happen. It gives me chills. It's not about oh, this is a problem that I need to fix and I'm going to save or something like that. But there's a different light that comes on.
Yeah, I think our nature is like that. That's our nature, and it's not something that we're even responsible for necessarily. It's just there is a goodness that exists, and it's hard to believe that sometimes when we see how things are going in the world.
Yeah,
and that just makes it all the more important to connect with that nature within ourselves.
Yeah.
But it's a real balance of we're not going to find that goodness through the guilt. And that's the real trick right now. It's navigating being in a position of such comfort and such privilege in these times when we're so much more. And I'm not even convinced that there's more suffering in the world than there ever has been. And I know that can be a controversial, argument of is the world getting better? Is it getting worse? There's always been suffering. I think that one thing that I can stand in as being relatively true is that we know more about the suffering in the world than we ever have in at least history that we're aware of, which I think we also have our history wrong in many regards. And I think that it's likely that we've mostly devolved as a species, since whatever we are thinking the beginning of our history is. That's a whole other tangent, but I don't think that we're actually, I say that I'm catching myself because I think there was probably a point in time where we actually were just as aware of every human being's experience on the planet, but maybe more through a different kind of power. But when it comes through social media, like through this thing on the phone and through the computer and through the television, and when we're able to know about things that are happening in other parts of the planet so intimately, it's creating a new iteration of the collective consciousness. And there isn't really a blueprint for how to navigate that. And I think it's very easy because of this to become crippled by that guilt.
Yeah.
But to relate to all that is in the present moment and connect to ourselves and actually audit, it's like all those first things that I said sound very spiritually bypassing, so it's like marrying that, relating to the present moment and ourself as that which is not inherited, the self which is, before anything we inherit, and then the elements and the spirits around us, the spirit of everything around us, the spirit of the world, the spirit of ourself, to relate in that way, that can lead to spiritual bypassing. But then you pair that with the values that you want to uphold. When you look at the world and you see the pain, if I can identify what is so painful when I look at the world, it's that there's this lack of care. It's that there's a lack of care. Yeah. And so it's helpful for me to distill that, because then I can say, okay, I have a value of care. Mm-hmm. So how do I audit my actions in the present moment from this spiritually, elementally grounded awareness of who I am before my body and my identity? How do I steward this body and this identity, this creature, based on that value of care? And how do I maximize that care in every one of my decisions in the present? Mm-hmm. Guilt has no place in that process. All that guilt does is shuts that down.
Sure.
So that's what it's like, opening my heart to everything I'm aware of, and then also finding, because care, again, applies to the self as well. So it's like, if I'm opening my heart to the pain in the world through my phone, which is also like questionable whether you're really opening your heart or where you're just tormenting your mind, But if it's taking me, whatever it is that I'm doing, if it's taking me to a point where I'm harming myself, now I'm not acting from care.
Yeah.
So that's why that value is so important, that I can see that clearly. Am I caring for all beings, myself included?
Yeah.
And so that's the best that I can do on that topic.
It's pretty fucking great. I think you took a very broad, complex, slippery thing and really wrapped it up nicely to package and deliver for people. I think a lot of people can, with a little bit of effort, track their values, can look at their routines and behavioral patterns and kind of see how they're playing out certain values and narratives in their lives. I imagine that most people listening, the part that feels like the uncatchable fish is actually what you would call step one, which is finding that vast sense of self, finding the I that is not the I. How do we loosen our grip on identity? Because I think it can be really easy to believe that we're doing well or loving another without seeing our blind spots. And the way to really filter that out is by, like you're saying, coming back to that really broad sense of being. And do you have any ideas about how people can do that when they're raising kids and working jobs and living in LA or cities and cultures that don't foster a sense of animacy or relationship? And we're all kind of lone wolfing it out here. So do you have any ideas?
Yeah, it's funny. I had one thing I wanted to add to what I was saying before, and then I just realized that it's kind of just part of the answer to the question that you just asked as well.
Love it.
Which is to just get perspective, seek perspective, seek perspective, particularly of people who are less comfortable than you. And that's something that I'm always trying to do in my life. It's like relate with people who are objectively suffering more than you in a personal way, not from guilt, definitely not from a place of trying to be a savior, definitely not from a place of even thinking that you have any way of helping them. I think help is a really dangerous realm to enter into, because help is usually judgment. I think it's more important to seek to understand than to help. So just seeking perspective is something that's become really important in my life. I believe that the fundamental reality on a spiritual level is that we can't have our comfortable fun and our good life without people in that position of suffering, as long as our good life requires that resources are exploited and extracted from some for a few, from the many for the few. So anyone who's holding down this role of having less is doing important spiritual work that I have a lot of respect for. And they're also doing important personal work that I don't have perspective on. So the more that I spend time, real time with people in those positions, not as a way of doing good, not as a way of being a good citizen, not as a way of being a savior, not as a way of being generous, not as a way of being a better person, as a way of getting perspective, as a way of seeing life through the eyes of anyone other than myself, but particularly people who have less comfort. Because comfort really, we get really used to our comfort, and then we always want more than what we have. That's just seems to be our nature. And so if I can just get that perspective and realize that, I have a bed to sleep in, period. That's huge. I'm not being bombed, period. That's huge. And relate to the people who are in those experiences that you don't understand. I think that that's actually, I was just wanting to add that to what I was saying before as a way of relating to this, living in a world that can be overwhelming, especially in a position of privilege, but also adding that as a way of realizing who you truly are. And this is something that is very common. It's called seva. It's like devotional service work, is that we spend time offering our presence to people who need the presence, not because I'm giving them something, but because they're helping me to realize who I really am. It's actually about that spiritual evolution and return to who I really am, because by being with other people, particularly who, my ego thinks it has a leg up on this person, and you spend time with them, and then you realize that you are them, and then you realize who you really are before that identity that you're comfortable with.
All of those comforts that you're describing, they're like cushy layers that keep us insulated from the elements. They keep us insulated from our own mortality. They can really numb us to the intimacy of life. We can become so insular in our nuclear homes and in our little bubbles that we can forget that we're a creature at all. People don't even go outside for a whole day or something like that. And when you're living with poverty, you're really tracking where your next meal is coming from. And you're really tracking where you're going to sleep that night. And there's like a primal circuitry that can light up. And I think there is an intelligence to that deserves a lot of respect.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another layer of the respect that I feel. And I mean, also as someone who's always, dancing along the poverty line myself, I wouldn't want more insulation. I wouldn't want to be more protected from reality, because at a certain level, it's like if you have more than your basic needs met, all that you're doing is removing yourself from the origin of things. That's all we're really, at least as creatures on a planet, that's all that's required of us. It's just sad that societally and economically it's harder for creatures to meet their basic needs because of the people that are buying into that economic status.
Yeah,
if
absolutely.
Only it was just, if only being in poverty was just actually whatever, I can just, I can still hunt and gather. So, it's like, and some people do. Also just acknowledging that there's a lot more people living an indigenous lifestyle currently than we tend to remember when we're so in our modern world. And even something that I like to acknowledge a lot when I teach about natural building is that The UN estimate, which I don't think is accurate, but the UN estimate is that at least a third of the world lives in earthen homes. And so it's like, it's not this thing that is, new or radical.
Yeah.
It's definitely not something that like Americans are going to save anyone with. That's my critique of permaculture and, natural building and these kinds of things in the West in general. It's like, we're just remembering how to do what like most of the rest of the world has always been doing and is still doing, and would be a lot better at doing and a lot more liberated in doing if we weren't stealing all the fucking resources.
Yeah.
So like, that just having that humility when we coming from where we're coming from and, being raised in the culture that we're raised in, even with relatively less, I grew up with less than most of the people around me. But still coming from this place where like this country exists because of the extraction from many, many people who just living their fucking life as a creature, and many people that are still doing that. And so that's all just to say that, like, adding to what you're saying, that, people who are more in touch with that basic creature reality have a lot to teach us.
Yes.
So it's a very important position to take and to train our colonized minds out of, train ourselves to see someone who's just getting by as more of a teacher than the billionaires, the politicians, the even the small business owner in your town that's a really good person, that's doing really good at their thing and they have a really ethical business. I don't have much to learn from that person. It's the person who doesn't have success societally that I have more to learn from. And that's, that's my worldview. You don't have to take that on, but for me, it's important. If my value is care, I'm not here to learn from people who are doing extraction well. I'm here to learn from people who are getting, and that's the important perspective to seek out.
I like that. Yeah, it's cool to hear the stats of earthen homes around the world, and it makes me think of how, most cultures in the world are animist cultures, that we are the ones that are, exalting reductionist thinking and, obsessed with materialism and really losing sight of what's truly at the center. So, yeah, coming back to your thought of, being in touch with reality, it's like, I think easy to forget that we're under a collective spell here in a pretty insular bubble. We're losing sight of the broader context. If we keep zooming out, we realize we're the minority here. We're the few, and there's a lot of big blind spots. So I really appreciate your invitation to broaden perspective and to seek out perspectives from those who are a little more tapped in.
And we're ultimately like, the other thing about the country that we live in is that it sets this example for the rest of the world. Unfortunately, there's this thing where like a lot of people want to do what America is doing. And I think in reality, we're all children of the earth. We're all children of spirit, and we aren't our nationality. We aren't any of these things. And really, it's just a matter of whether this sickness of colonization, or whatever you want to call it, I mean, that's a loaded word, but I think it's an accurate word to describe the sickness. It's just a matter of whether you're monitoring that or not, because it's present in the collective, no matter where you are or where you're from. And I mean, it's even like lifestyle doesn't even shelter you from that anymore. There are many indigenous people who have Coca-Cola in plastic bottles. And it's like, it's not about judging the lifestyle or even the desire to drink a Coca-Cola or, these things. It's never about these particularities. You can be completely removed from this culture that we were brought up in and still be infected with that reductionist colonial view of I'm taking, I'm extracting from the world around me. And tradition doesn't necessarily shelter you from that either.
I appreciate the term infection and seeing it really like the colonization is the ultimate epidemic of our time, you know.
It is.
It is, and it's highly parasitic, and I feel like it takes a lot of effort to notice it and track it, let alone dismantle it. How can people get their hands back with the elements? How can people foster a sense of remembrance? I think most people feel like cultural orphans. We don't feel connected to our ancestry, or there can even be frustrations around knowing that we're the descendants of colonizers. If we're honestly and earnestly wanting to find our way to building that relationship and having our own, path light up. If someone's really new here and stumbling into our conversation, I mean, what would be some things you would want to direct them toward to help to kindle that spark?
That's a great question. Yeah. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is definitely a relationship with soil and plants. Just, if you've never planted a tree and tended to a tree, that's a great place to start. If you don't have anywhere to plant the tree, get a pot and plant any little plant that will fit in that pot and water it, and just have that relationship. That's obviously a very entry level suggestion, but it's important because that's how we start to recognize that plant is not an object. That's a being that I'm in relationship with. And that changes perspective. Also, like I was saying, just spend time with people who have less than you and listen to them. Like really put yourself in spaces where, and just give yourself that moment of lucidity when you like see the person that you would typically ignore and, not want to look at because it's uncomfortable. See if you can turn your attention towards them. Be curious and like be willing to actually, because most people are actually really beautiful. I would say most people, especially people who are just trying to get by and don't have a societal leg up, are really beautiful people that we have a lot to learn from. And so definitely slow down, and especially people who are connected to their cultural heritage, whatever it may be. It doesn't matter what their heritage is. If they're connected to their cultural heritage, their ancestry, and they have practices that are intact, that are connected, especially to the planet, listen to those people, seek out those people in your life because they're around you. They're often people around you that you don't know about that are doing that kind of work.
Yeah, that's really good.
There's probably, and it doesn't matter if you're in a city or in a rural place, there are always people around you who have cultural, ancestral knowledge that they're practicing in their lives. And I would, it's not a rule of thumb, but I would suggest that they probably aren't going to be very flashy people with many, badges of societal success that you might be attracted to. And they're usually not promoting their work online. They're usually not, these aren't people who have some entrepreneur self-started spiritual self-help thing that they're offering. Look for the people who are actually connected to their indigenous ancestry, to what has been passed down, and just hang out with them. And then also, like, specifically, if you're looking to get more on land and, get out of a city, seek to be guided by indigenous people on the land where they're living, and the people who have that long-standing relationship with the land wherever you're going. Again, a hard thing sometimes to find online, and also a sensitive thing to seek out when you're not part of that community or part of that culture. So it's something to be sensitive to and come into humbly and with a genuine curiosity and willingness to be of service and to learn. But I think that anytime you're coming with that intention, you'll be welcome. But if you're trying to insert yourself and trying to bring something to people who need something from you, that's not usually going to be appreciated.
Or extract the indigenous coin for your little spiritual purse. It's
definitely,
tricky.
Yeah,
it's tricky.
Definitely don't do it from that place. And and it's like, it's very, very tricky.
Yeah.
But
what
just
about
check yourself on those things.
Yeah, totally. What about just getting outside? I mean, I think about like the ratio of a human body to a natural body, like wide open spaces, bodies of water, like wandering, spending time outside, like go outside.
Go outside every day. Don't ever let a day pass where you don't go outside. I mean, I don't have an inside. Like my house doesn't even really have doors that fully close. So I don't I overlook
maybe you
that,
skip it because it's so,
I skip it. Yeah. Don't let yourself, if you're interested in these conversations, I'm not telling everyone what to do, right? But based on the context of advice that you asked me to give, don't ever let a day pass where you don't go outside.
Yeah.
That cannot happen. Let the sun touch your skin. Let your feet touch the earth, your bare feet on the earth. Let your bare hands touch the earth. Touch the plants. Breathe. Be aware of at least a few breaths. Take deep breaths. And be grateful for the breaths. Be grateful. Speak to the sun. Martine Prechtel, it's something, if you're not aware of Martine Prechtel, beautiful person to learn from. But I love how something he says, just say hello to the sun in the morning. I mean, that's just such a huge, just go outside, say hello, thank you. Thank you for another day. And to start developing that relationship. You know, thank you for the breath that we're breathing. Thank you. We're breathing the same air as the trees. You know, every time you see a tree, you can thank them. So definitely always don't let a day pass where you don't go outside and do your best to acknowledge the things that you're in connection to, which are always water, always air, always sunlight, always the earth, at least those things you're always in a relationship with. Thank them. Be grateful for them. Recognize the animacy of these beings that you're sustaining yourself from. And then I would also add, if this is all like, all right, Sage, get to the, I'm doing all these things already. What else can I do?
Well, I mean, what's interesting before you say it, what's interesting about this is, yes, they're very foundational and basic. And I think our inclination is to want to skip over them because they're so basic. But if we're actually embracing these as foundational pieces of our lives, we might want to check ourselves, like, how consistent am I with this? And am I really opening up to the wonder of this? I mean, did I go outside and or am I really feeling the dimension of this experience, really giving ourselves to it? So it might feel too simple, but I think it's actually very, very rich.
That's a great point. Yeah, I appreciate that too, because really anything else that I would say and what I'm about to say is secondary to that. And it's really not that important, because at the end of the day, I think what we all want is to be relieved of this need to have more, do more, be more.
Yeah.
Even if it's in this context of, be more spiritually connected, be more elemental, be more, just like, we all want to be relieved of that. So literally just being outside and actually feeling the enormity and wonder of all that is and that we're connected to is enough. That is enough.
Say it again so I can really feel the truth of that. It's actually enough. Like, I don't have to do or have some kind of fantastical experience or psychedelic.
If it's not enough, it's because I have not yet felt the beingness of all that is beyond my own self. So if I sit with the sunset, for example, which is a very important thing to me, I try to be with the sunset every day if you can, things like that. But if I sit with the sunset and then the sun sets and then I think, well, now I feel kind of lonely, is that what are my friends up to? Or, what am I going to have for dinner even if I don't feel lonely, what do I need to do tomorrow? Like if my mind goes directly back into what am I going to next? What can I get next? What can I have next? What can I do to be more next? I'm not really sitting with the enormity of that being that is the sun setting. Like if I'm with that, it's huge. It's so
Yeah.
huge that it like, you know, it's like,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter. You know, it doesn't matter what's next. Because guess what's next? The stars.
It's so good.
That's it. You know, it's
so
literally,
good.
it's always enough. So you can always, and you can even do that in a building. Again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier with see things as if they're looking at you. See the thing looking at you and get there to that level of empathy and connection where you're like, whoa, I feel like I'm being witnessed by this being.
Yeah.
And if I can be in that, then there's really no room for the not enoughness.
Totally. The
So
wonder opens to intimacy, which opens to deep satiation and fulfillment. And I feel like that really is the antidote to this capitalist urge, right? It's like, just be with it. Just be here. Soak it in. Bask in it. Like really receive it and see how much you actually need then.
Yeah, exactly. See how much you actually need. And that applies to everything. I mean, I've done a lot of work all over the country, and I go out and do this and that, and I'm often guided by these values and wanting to work in places where, like, especially the value of like societal privilege and wanting to be in communities where people don't have as much, and bringing my work to those communities and being taught by those people and learning from those people and just having that more human experience. But then I realized, you know, I come back to Ojai, I'm like, oh, this town of just rich white people that are all surface level, blah, 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 where a lot of my best friends live, you know, so it's like a total hypocrisy. But like, I'm overlooking the all of the beautiful people who are holding down their native traditions right here on this land that I would be connecting with if I weren't searching for the next thing to go do in some other state where I think there's people who are going to be more resonant with that value that I'm seeking out. Yeah. So it's like, sometimes the values aren't even enough. It's like, we have to actually get simple enough that we are intimate with the wonder of all things, so we can slow down enough so that then we can notice the person who's literally right there. You didn't notice because they didn't have the badge of recognition. But then you're like, oh my God, I'm learning so much from this person that's like lives next door to me.
Totally.
You know?
Totally. And I feel like when we do slow down, we're in a more receptive state, and life really does come to us. It's a lot less effort. It's a lot less push. It's a lot less go, and everything starts emerging. You know, all of the magic coming out of the woodwork, and so much more dimension in our immediate sphere. I think it's a really important part of this conversation.
That intimacy with all things and feeling the animacy of things, feeling that you're being witnessed by them, that they have being. And then you just start to see that things are always, like you're saying, things are emerging, here. Things are growing, things are happening now. And that's something that you can't just quite encompass by saying, be here now. You know, it's becomes such a catchphrase, but it is, I mean, it really is the only moment. It's right now. But starting to see things coming out of the now and feel them as having their own beingness is a very subtle shift that changes everything.
And I think it really does start with the discipline of learning how to be and dismantling that, you know, decolonizing our mind and shifting the pacing of our body so that we can slow down. So,
Absolutely.
What a good conversation.
Yeah, it's been really fun. The one thing I was going to add to, like, you know, what can we do is I just have been thinking a lot also about the American dream and, you know, how it also infects us and how we want, you know, even people who are trying their best are still thinking about, like, how can I lock in this security for myself and my family, you know, maybe through buying a home and having a mortgage or buying land. And I'm caught by the buying land thing too, you know, as someone who doesn't have, like, ownership of a place. And I think that's a valid thing to want, but I think opening our minds to more communal realities of that kind of relative security, which security is, you know, a questionable concept anyway, but at least just having that feeling of, like, I'm not paying rent for this thing that's never really going to be mine. And even if you're paying a mortgage on a house, you're paying a mortgage on a house that's, really just a bunch of toxic chemicals that are rotting as soon as they're put together, and you're going to have to keep paying contractors to rip you off to keep maintaining it. And
dang it,
you don't have any relationship with that house at the end of the day. Like,
fuck.
Those materials aren't serving you anything really. So like, what is it that we're really trying to get to, and is there maybe a way to do it that doesn't require so many middlemen and so many corporate interests, and so much interest,
sure.
and so much, just so much isolation as well. Does your family really need the 2,000 to 3,000 square foot house with its own washer and dryer and its own this and its own everything that you were told you need? Do you really need it? And if you do, that's okay, whatever. But also ask yourself where all those things come from. Or just don't ask any of these questions. But again, if we're here in this conversation, there's a way for you to find that security that doesn't require you following that path. And maybe it looks like forming a land trust with some of your dearest friends or with your family members, or a combination. And putting that money that you've worked hard for and earned, that you're going to put into a down payment, maybe you want to put it into land somewhere, into building a home that's actually of the place where you're going to live, and that's actually built with materials that you can be in relationship with, and materials that didn't harm anyone to become your home. Like, there's just ways to like do kind of a fusion of like, you can still own property and know why you want that, but do it in a way that looks a little bit different. There's a lot of pathways.
I appreciate you really highlighting the need to step away from this hyper individualized mode and to think about how we can approach things in a community-based way. And the way we approach our housing, the way we find our sense of belonging and stationing on land. And also, I think just even simply for people who don't have access to these broad types of questions, like, how are you cooking your meals? Sharing meal prep together, coming together more for these things that we're all, told we need to separate and do in our little boxes, but coming together to share the domestic load, to share the emotional load, to share the decision-making process of how do we find our way, to establish a sense of home in the world, really finding your people and coming together with them, I think, is a huge part of it. Huge. There's one last thing I want to ask before we go. Do you feel like you have bandwidth for one more?
Yeah.
Okay. It's such a difficult time right now. I mean, we're recording this in the pocket where, election is on its way. Gaza has been rolling for almost a year. There's a lot of division and there's a lot of polarization and climate. I mean, there's just such a sense of urgency from the collective. It's like everything is screaming, everything's on fire. It's so loud in the world right now. And we've talked a lot about, in the face of that urgency, the need to slow down. And we've talked about the importance of coming into our big self so that we're not run by our small selves. But in the specific context of how we're navigating culture right now and how we're navigating what we're up against in the collective, is there anything you could say about why it really matters to foster our spiritual path, to foster our creativity, to foster our intuition?
I think that those things are that's how we give back to our source, our creativity and our intuition. And that's also makes me think of Martine Prechtel and a lot of indigenous cultures that just speak about making beauty. And Martine Prechtel specifically speaks about feeding the holy, which is just such a
I love that.
Such a beautiful poetic way of describing it. But it's what we're here to do. And really the state of the world, again, I don't want to sound spiritually bypassy with this because we've already addressed that. But that world that has that urgency, I mostly am only in contact with it through media. I mean, I know a lot of people will be like, well, you have to be involved politically and you have to vote and you have to protest. And there's nothing wrong with any of that. And I'm also okay with being judged for what I'm saying. But I think that the most important thing is bring that care into where you are and make life more beautiful for the people around you, for yourself, for no one. Do something beautiful that no one will ever see, because everything is watching you. You're always being witnessed by all of life. So just, you know, when we lament and we feel disempowered by all of the this and the that, it's not empowering us to make beauty. And if we want more beauty and more care, let's just do our best to make more beauty and more care where we are. And to feel more where we are, to feel more of what's around us. If knowing the state of the world is helping me to do that, which it does for me personally, then good. But if it's making it so that I'm frozen and numb and shut off, that's not good. That's not helping. You know, it's not, you don't need to be updated about every single disaster to be a good person. You don't need to, you know, and I think that a big theme in that we could speak for hours on probably is needing to be right. That's the big culprit underneath all of this. Is like, the reason, I'll go out on a limb here even and say, just speaking for myself, the reason that a lot of the world issues are so emotional for me is not necessarily just compassion. It's not necessarily just that I care about the people that are being harmed and that I want to protect human life and that I want to create more beauty and care. It's also that I want to be right. It's also that I want to be right about how wrong it is what they're doing. There's always this little bit of that righteousness built in when it's about something that isn't in my life directly. Like if it's an issue that is happening outside of my immediate scope of influence, there's a certain amount of righteousness that's causing me to feel emotionally invested in it. And that righteousness is dangerous because the people who are causing that harm think they're right. At the end of the day, everyone's just a human being doing what they think is right. And so genocide, that's being acted out by people who think that they're doing what's right for them and their people. So we have to be really aware of when we look at things like that and say that's wrong, be aware of the one who thinks he's right, because that righteousness leads us to do those things. So there's a certain level of precarity on the world stage when all the information is coming through very short, you know, blips of media and things. And even if you go longer form, if you're not like day to day in that community that you're thinking about, it's really easy for your emotional investment to be coming from a place of righteousness. It's easier to be grounded in compassion when it's like you're with the people. You know, and there are people that are suffering around you, I promise. So like having that lived experience of like, oh my God, like you are feeling that and experiencing that right now, right next to me, right where I live. It's easier to let righteousness just completely disappear. Like it's not even letting it just disappears in those moments. So, you know, when we're removed, it's easier to have that righteousness. And I think that's an important thing to watch out for.
I really appreciate that. And I think it just emphasizes your encouragement to people for like seeking perspective and really trying to broaden your scope of the way you're looking at things. Really important. And we probably could talk for hours. We won't, but I do want to tag along just a quick thought with that, which is when that division and that polarity is emerging in any kind of situation, in any kind of interpersonal conflict, coworker, friend, partner, housemate, child, whatever it is, I feel like a way that we can metabolize that a little bit is to, whatever our disdain is, you know, oh, they're the oppressor. Oh, they're the heartless one. Oh, they're extracting. Oh, they're hoarding. You know, whatever the judgment is, we metabolize that by checking ourselves. Where are the places where I might be doing that even 1% in my life. Where are the places in me that have an inclination even toward that? You know, I might not be actively doing it, but I can feel the urge. You know, and we can really not just see ourselves reflected, but to really feel viscerally ourselves in the other. The more we do that, I think the less we can dehumanize that other person. It's the
Absolutely.
fast track for empathy building and compassion and understanding. And I think we need to be actively pursuing those ways of bridging the gaps to find the common ground, as opposed to picking apart the way you're doing it, or the way you said that, or the way you're standing. You know, more of this, actually.
Yeah, actually making more beauty.
Yes.
You know, really looking for the beauty and making it so, and seeing it in people that we disagree with. You know, seeing it in things that we don't accept. We don't have to agree with everything. We don't have to. I can say that's wrong, but still accept that it exists and even see beauty in it. And that's a real, you know, fine line to walk. But I can, you know, seeing that something exists allows me to interact with it. See, even if I think that it's wrong, it exists. And then, you know, that's true of people. It's like, if I disagree with someone, I can own that, and I can be in the reality of that, rather than getting up into the intellectual space of just all the ways that we polarize ourselves with people. And then it's just it's really quick once you relate to people in that way to dehumanize them.
Totally.
And that's why we're seeing what we're seeing. It's just anything that we're doing in our lives that's allowing us to dehumanize others is a place where we need to, like you're saying, we need to check, how am I doing that? You know, see it in the world. How are you doing it? And then also, if you live in America, you are living in the country that's, you know, leading the empire. So, I mean, you know, maybe that's an overstatement, but we're pretty big, you know,
pretty big.
The US is a pretty big player in the, you know, imperial dominant system of the world. And like, it's like, there's always ways to divest, you know, and it's like, it's not enough to just divest from certain corporations that are supporting certain things that you don't. Just divest from all corporations if you can, you know, like, and again, don't fall into the guilt, don't fall into the purism of it has to be, but like, do what you can do to
opt out.
Not only divest and opt out and like not support these things that you genuinely believe are wrong. Like, first of all, just start that commitment now, because that's very empowering. Like, I will not support these things. And then also, if the empire were to fall tomorrow, and this whole thing, whatever that means to you, you know, because everyone has a different definition of what I just said, but whatever that means to you, if like the world were to just be, you know, overnight, you know, restored into a place of like, you know, more equal power. Are you ready for that? Or are all of your sources of sustenance going to fall apart?
Yeah.
If they are, try to build a life based on your values. Just start now to try to build a life based on your values, because if we're praying for liberation of all people, be ready for liberation of all people. Because especially if you're living in the US, and especially if you're listening to this right now, if you're in a privileged enough position to be listening to this, you are benefiting from the oppression of the many. And so when liberation of all people happens, and I know that you're praying for it, because also if you're listening to this, you're probably praying for that. Are you ready for the systems that are supporting your life to not exist? The systems that are harming and oppressing those people that you want to be liberated.
It's a hefty checkpoint.
Start getting ready. My friend just told me about, like, I had two different friends. One who was speaking about how, you know, if you're surprised when your prayers are answered, you weren't really praying. And then another friend, or, you know, pray as if you won't be surprised. And then another friend who was sharing, she was in a living in community, and they were praying for rain. And an elder said, have you prepared for the rain?
Yeah.
And they're like, no. And she's like, well, you better start tarping everything up if you're praying for rain. And they tarped everything up and it rained.
Awesome.
But like, that's such a potent part of our existence, is where, if you're already clued into this spiritual relationship with all of life, and you have prayer as a part of your life, and you're actively praying for things, you have to be ready. You have to do that work, that personal work, to actually be ready to receive the prayers being answered. And looking at the global stage, looking at world peace, looking at liberation of all beings, you got to get ready for that. Get ready for it now. If you're praying for it, you have to mean it. And if you mean it, you have to live a life that's ready for those systems to collapse.
Yeah.
You have to be ready for that.
Yeah. And I think we all have, rolling up our sleeves and a lot of work to be done when it comes to what that actually means. And I think a lot of us don't even really know where to begin, ideas and practical ways for people to prepare themselves internally, externally for being more resilient,
Look for a local community group where you live that's talking about just basic needs being met, how to meet basic needs locally without global supply chains.
Yeah.
And if that doesn't exist, start one. Just start, see, because a lot of people care about this right now.
Yeah.
Now maybe more than ever, as we're becoming more and more aware, as we have more and more knowledge of the global supply chain and the global imperialist mechanism.
The belly is bulging.
Yeah, it's just like, whoa, this is kind of sketchy, isn't it, guys? And
a little wobbly.
And even this isn't like a preppy thing. This isn't about like ready for the apocalypse. This is about living a life now that actually reflects your values.
Yeah.
If you're praying for liberation, again, I'm not telling you to pray for the liberation of all people. If you are praying for the liberation of all people, do your best to live a life that can actually make space for the liberation of all people.
Yeah. Beautiful.
That's all.
Beautiful. Yeah. I can hear everyone cheering behind us. Yeah. Yeah. It's good. Thank you so much. I had these ideas that we were going to talk about living systems and natural building, and we really just kind of wrapped our hearts around the whole world.
Yeah. That's what is alive for me right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Perfect. Well, thank you again, and hope to talk again soon.
Definitely. Yeah. Thanks for facilitating this wonderful conversation. It's been really beautiful.
Bringing all of the wisdom and ferocity and passion that you are. It's good.
Thank you. Thanks for holding such a strong container.
Heck yeah, man.
Hi, my name is Sage Stoneman, and I call my work home, spelled H-O-M-B. Womb home. Housing opportunities made beautifully. Also healing opportunities made beautifully. You can find some windows into my work online at sagestoneman.com, where you can also sign up to be on my mailing list. I will send emails when there's an upcoming in-person workshop. You can also follow me on Instagram at Sage Stoneman. And there are also some YouTube video links to check out. Thank you for being here today. You're doing great.
Thanks for tuning in to The Dreaming Wild. Do you have a magical tale or episode idea? Go to thedreamingwild.com to leave a voicemail, get featured on the show, and join our patron community meetups. We've got an alchemical cauldron of inspiration brewing. You should definitely come check it out. Thank you so much for listening, sharing, and subscribing. It's your generosity that keeps the project alive. Sending so much love from my heart to yours. See you next time.